Hello, good people of the world. So, the United States has just wrapped up its so-called Summit for Democracy. This is the second iteration of such event, the last one happening in 2021. As happened in the past, it has been marred in controversy because only a certain amount of countries have been invited. That is 120 out of a total of 193 UN-recognized member states. Now, a number of important countries were left off the invitee list, such as Russia and China, of course, deemed the major U.S. adversaries. The list, however, did expand this year with countries like Honduras, Ivory Coast, Gambia, Mauritania, Mozambique, Tanzania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Liechtenstein joining the list of invitees. Yay! Good for them. The U.S. also invited civil society members from countries left off the invitation list, such as Nicaragua and Belarus. However, most importantly, two U.S. allies, part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, Turkey and Hungary, were left off. The reason for this decision is reportedly because both countries are experiencing what officials describe as democratic backsliding, but it belies a serious disagreement with key Washington allies over interference in their internal affairs. Both countries have routinely criticized U.S. officials for meddling in their domestic political situations and pointed out the hypocrisy of Uncle Sam's own backyard faring quite awfully in terms of democratic backsliding. Today, we're going to speak with a journalist from Mexico, José Luis Granados Ceja. He's a journalist and political analyst based in Mexico City. He is a staff writer with Venezuela Analysis, covering regional and international issues, and writes a monthly opinion column for the Mexico Solidarity Project. He is currently pursuing a master's degree in the defense and promotion of human rights at the Universidad Autónoma de la Ciudad de Mexico. So, we are on here with our guest, Jose. We're talking about the recent Summit for Democracy that happened in the United States. Now, Jose, you're writing for Venezuela Analysis, and of course, this is a country that was not invited to the summit. However, there are certain rapprochements that are happening between Venezuela and the United States. So I hope you can speak to, first of all, this hypocrisy that the United States has not invited Venezuela, which, by the way, Jimmy Carter himself, former president of the United States, said that the electoral system within Venezuela is a model for the world. It's a great example of a great electoral democracy, and the systems, in fact, that they use in Venezuela are widely used in the United States. And these were, a topic of discussion by the Trump administration. And as well, now we're seeing rapprochement by the Biden administration. They have since recognized Juan Guaido as of course, as the interim president of Venezuela, as they called him. But now they're doing oil trading with Venezuela now that there's an inflation crisis in the United States. So I hope you can give us a little bit of information about this, about what's going on there.
Sure, absolutely. It's good to be here with you today. When we see things like the Summit for Democracy, we have to think about the way that historically the United States has always used the issue of democracy, of human rights, as a weapon. I think it's right to say that they've weaponized this topic in order to advance their foreign policy interests. And that's what this summit is about. It's not actually about democracy. Biden campaigned on this promise about restoring the United States' place in the world, about affirming the need for support for democracies in the world because they were under threat by authoritarian regimes. None of this is new. Historically, this has always been the kind of rhetoric that the United States has used in order to advance its interests. And what are its interests? Well, it's the interests of the U.S. ruling class. In 2021, his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, released a statement putting human rights at the center of U.S. foreign policy, saying that they were committed to foreign policy that is in line with democratic values, with diplomatic leadership that is centered on the defense of democracy and the protection of human rights. But you can actually go back to a State Department memo from 1981, and it's virtually the same exact language. And they say human rights is at the core of our foreign policy because it is central to what America is and stands for. Human rights is not something we tack onto our foreign policy, but is the very purpose, the defense and promotion of freedom in the world. So this is from 1981. We can see that's virtually the same that what Blinken said in 2021. And that's because like I said, it's the weaponization of this issue of saying that they defend democracy and human rights when they absolutely don't. And I think you bring up Venezuela. I think that's the perfect example of it. The United States has put criminal sanctions on the Venezuelan people because of a supposed democracy deficit. You read any bourgeois media, any corporate media coverage of Venezuela, and they will always mention 2018 election that Maduro was reelected was widely viewed as fraudulent, but they never tell you why. It's that famous adage where if you repeat a lie enough that people start to believe it. Well, that's the case. They never substantiate these. The government of Venezuela is democratically elected. The people decided that they want to continue with this project that they call the Bolivarian Revolution. But because that is at odds with the interests of Washington, they label them as autocrats. And then that's kind of what this summit is all about as well. It's about trying to artificially divide the world into these two camps. We're the good guys, we're the democracies, and they're the bad guys, they're the autocracies. It kind of reminds me a bit of Bush's Axis of Evil speech. And I mention this because it's not just Biden and it's not just Trump, but it's actually part of the foreign policy establishment of Washington. It has always been that way. And it's actually a threat to the democratic aspirations of people throughout the world. Venezuela in the communes, right? These are spaces where the Venezuelan campesinos, where the Venezuelan working class decides collectively in assemblies how to manage the affairs of their communities, but also they control the means of production. I mean, for me, these are the most authentic democratic spaces in the entire continent. And yet we get lectured by the United States about what is or isn't democracy. Well, that's because for them, democracy is two corporate ruling class parties trading power back and forth, always against the interests of the vast majority of these countries, the working class majority of these countries.
Now, you talked about this division. I think I've written a lot about this kind of bifurcation of the world system that we're seeing unfold before us. Now, there is 120 countries that were invited to this so-called Summit for Democracy. There are 193 UN member states. That means 73. If we're just doing basic, back of the book math here, we're seeing 73 countries did not get invited. So that immediately shows you that there is a clear distinction between what the U.S. deems a democracy and what they don't deem a democracy, right? And so we've seen actually recently, China, for example, just had a conference that many people were at, like George Galloway and Li Camp. They were attending China's conference on full people's democracy, or the full process people's democracy that they have going on in China. Now, China has a different interpretation of democracy that's different than the Western style. It is its own branch of democracy, and it works quite well for people. We see that, poll after poll shows that the Chinese people have a great reverence and respect for the government. The approval ratings are much higher than any president I've ever seen in the United States, for example. Can you speak a little bit to this kind of bifurcation that we're seeing play out from Washington?
Yeah, there was a joint statement from Russia and China right after there was a high-level meeting between them on February 4th, 2022. And in that joint statement, they said something that I thought actually was really commendable. It's the kind of language that I'm really grateful is now part of the public discourse. And it was the following: certain states attempt to impose their own democratic standards, in quotes, on other countries to monopolize their right to assess the level of compliance with democratic criteria, to draw dividing lines based on the grounds of ideology, including by establishing exclusive blocks and alliances of convenience, prove to be nothing but flouting of democracy and go against the spirit and true values of democracy. I think that really sums it up. I mean, it's actually anti-democratic to try to divide the world in this way, to say that there's only one model. And if that model is sort of the Western capitalist representative model, well, then wonder that democracy is in crisis, because this model doesn't actually deliver results to the population. Of course, people are frustrated with it, right? And they're right. Like, look at what's happening right now in Paris, in throughout France, in protests against what is basically an undemocratic imposition. Does this really represent the will of of the population, I'm certain that these reforms that want to increase the retirement age are wildly unpopular. But that's how this system works. It imposes the will of the ruling class, of the elites of the world, onto the vast majority of the population. That's not democratic in the slightest. But, when they go to great lengths to try to convince you that the world is divided into two camps, that democracy is in peril, well, if they're struggling to convince you that it's working, it's probably not working. And that's what we're seeing, right? It's actually a failure of their systems, and they see it, but they're not willing to go and prescribe the actual solution to that, which is how do we actually make it so that our own democracies are truly accountable and representative? No, they want to keep going with the status quo because the status quo works for the people who back these parties, who back politicians like Trump, like Biden. It doesn't really matter who they are. It's two wings of the same ideology. Biden's conviction that the world will be divided between democracies and autocracies, it's actually part of a ruling class strategy to continue to promote U.S. hegemony, because U.S. hegemony is in crisis. I've seen some analysts call this a new Cold War. I'm not sure how useful that kind of rhetoric is, because I think things can get worse before they get better. So we might be a little, precipitating ourselves a little bit by saying that we're in a new Cold War. But certainly we should recognize that there is this deliberate effort to divide the world into these camps. And so what they're trying to do is ensure U.S. hegemony. They're trying to make it so, because there's these two camps, you have to be with us. There's the conflict in Ukraine right now. Right, there's tremendous diplomatic pressure, less so today, but certainly when the conflict broke out, for states like Mexico, for example, where I live and work, to take a side, to oppose, the special operation in Ukraine by Russia. And obviously, the Mexican diplomatic apparatus resisted that, right? There was this idea that you have to be with us. And if you're not with us, then you're part of, this group that we've, designated autocracies. And that's really dangerous because, there is an interest of countries, particularly those in the global south, in developing and emerging economies, to try to diversify their relationships. Latin America in particular has always had a very close relationship with the United States and have paid the price for that. Obviously, we can get into the history of coups and regime change operations backed by the United States throughout the region. But this idea that there are other poles, the idea of a multipolar world, is a favorable one to countries like those throughout Latin America, because that we can turn to someone else, that there isn't only one option, and one option that is frankly very disfavorable, right? The trends have been moving in a different direction. Now, whereas 20 years ago, the number one trading partner for all of Latin American countries, without exception, was the United States. Well, that's now changed. The vast majority of them, with few exceptions, Central America and Mexico, the number one trading partner is China, right? The world is changing, and that makes policymakers and the ruling class in the United States very nervous. And so they're willing to invent this kind of rhetoric in order to try to maintain that hegemony, but I don't think they're going to be successful.
You mentioned this whole idea of us being in a new Cold War, and I think a lot of people don't understand that the old Cold War, that is the one between the Soviet Union and the United States in the 20th century, there was quite a lot of mechanisms to de-escalate situations. There was a lot of diplomatic channels, there was a lot of people-to-people exchanges, a lot of various different formats to de-escalate crisis around the world. And those mechanisms are not in place now, for example, between the United States and China. We have seen, for example, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei. There is no serious dialogue between Washington and Beijing right now, the two world's leading superpowers. That is quite a dangerous and I would say horrifying prospect for the world, to imagine that we are in a new Cold War. I think it kind of dampens really this, the actual crisis that we face now, which is that it's actually much more of a dangerous situation today than it was back then. I mean, there was more nuclear weapons, of course, in existence back in the day, like back in the old Cold War, of course, but, the START treaties kind of reduced these, the SALT treaties and so on. But the actual diplomatic situation and the global security situation is much different now, and we don't have these same mechanisms. Now, something I want to turn to here is about the hypocrisy of the United States and its allies on democracy. And you mentioned, for example, in Europe, and we're also seeing this in the Czech Republic, where they have just more than double, cut in half the valorization of pensions this year, and they did this. They rammed it through the parliament in a state of legislative emergency, which is completely against the Constitution to apply it to this fiscal year now. So it's kind of like the same situation in France. Didn't raise the retirement age yet. They were talking about it, but they didn't do it yet. I'm imagining there would be a lot of protests here in Prague like they were in September of last year. If that were to take place, people are already organizing around this if such an event happens. Now, there was a study that was published by the New York Times that said that the majority of democratic backsliding in the decades of the 2010s happened with the U.S. and its allies, which are defined by countries that have a formal or implied security alliance with the United States. So those countries, the countries that are either the United States or allied militarily with the United States, were responsible for the majority of global democratic backslides, while the rest of the world was responsible for most of democratic gains, right? So, what some European politicians call, the jungle, right? It actually appears that this so-called jungle is actually responsible for most of the world's democratic, forward progress in democracy. So could you speak to that a little bit, the hypocrisy about the United States, its track record on democracy, along with its allies, as well as the progression we're seeing of democratic rights in the global South?
Yeah, sometimes I think that part of the problem is that people inside the United States and those making these kinds of decisions that are promoting this kind of thinking have a very narrow view as to what constitutes democracy. They think that simply depositing a vote every few years is sufficient. And it's funny that the United States doesn't even have direct elections of its president. You can frequently lose the popular vote and still
That's right.
become
And the
president.
Senate used to not be elected either until
That's
about
right.
100 years ago.
Exactly. And so it speaks to just, that we're being lectured by people who don't actually practice this. And that's kind of true of US foreign policy in general. But, you point to the dangers this promotes. It's true, right? Like when you actually don't have a system that represents the will of the population, then you end up kind of creeping towards open conflict, closing the door to dialogue, closing the door to diplomacy, and that puts us at risk, right? And because they have such a limited, narrow understanding of what democracy is, they consider that only civil and political rights are the ones worth champion. Well, they obviously sideline the democratic, the economic, social, and cultural rights, which are just they're complementary. I studied the defense and promotion of human rights here in Mexico at a master's program, and it was one of the things that we really maintain. It's something that's actually been true of the countries of the global South. We've always had a different kind of understanding, a more holistic, complete understanding as to what constitutes human rights. And if you sideline economic, social, and cultural rights in the name of defending political and civil rights, well, you're actually betraying your commitment to human rights. They can't exist without each other. And so when we talk about the expansion of democracy and human rights in the global South, that's because there's a more serious commitment to addressing the social debt, which is some of the language that we use here. This idea that as a result of the lack of investment in the population, we're talking about declining services, declining infrastructure, poor healthcare, poor education, what you name it, that we actually have to pay back that debt. That there needs to be a social investment. And that actually should be understood as an expansion of democratic values. Can we say it's a democracy if there are people, the vast majority of the population, living in extreme poverty? Absolutely not, right? Like that's not a democratic system. Just because you can go and vote if you feel like it, when none of the parties represent you, then you live in a democracy. I hardly think so. And so that's the challenge of the countries in the global South, is to try to change the language around that. This idea that it's also important to attend to people's social needs. And so when we here in the global South see this kind of posturing from the United States, it's very troubling because it's also, very convenient. Who are some of the key allies of the United States in the world? It's Israel. Israel is an apartheid state. Apartheid states can't be democratic. Saudi Arabia. There's been decades of talk of reform in Saudi Arabia, but when it comes to counter hegemonic forces like those in the government of Venezuela, well, in that case, then they do talk about democracy and human rights, and then allege that these systems that are not democratic. I mentioned previously, I'm based here in Mexico, and what we've seen recently over the last couple of weeks is a dramatic escalation of the rhetoric against the government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. There's talk about war crimes against Mexico, openly
I was talking about
flaunting this
invading
idea
the
of
country.
invasions, of drone strikes, with or without the consent of Mexico. That's an act of war. Do people understand that? We've gone through over a year of rhetoric about the untouchable political sovereignty of Ukraine. This is the language of the people who defend, massive and billions of dollars going to arms in Ukraine because they have to protect sovereignty. But they can so easily discard those ideas when they talk about Mexico. And again, it's the same thing as Venezuela. Why are they doing this? Because Andrés Manuel López Obrador is trying to rescue the national oil company, because he's saying no to foreign investment in the electricity production and distribution in Mexico, which threatens the interests of US and Canadian capital. That's why we're seeing this kind of ramping up of rhetoric against Mexico. And so it's very hypocritical for them to pontificate, to lecture about democracy when their political representatives are actually floating really dangerous anti-democratic ideas. And so Lindsey Graham, for example, has been really insistent on this point. He was grilling Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, around this issue just last week, saying, well, will you designate these cartels foreign terrorist organizations? Because then we can actually have the tools that we need. And the Biden administration should be sounding the alarm bells around this. We're supposed to be allies. We have this massive free trade agreement together. And instead, what did Blinken say? That they'll consider it. And that designation of foreign terrorist organizations is just a pretext. It's an excuse to engage in military operations against a sovereign state. And this should be clear that if that does happen, the relationship will totally deteriorate. The United States needs Mexico as much as Mexico needs the United States, and they are playing with fire. And these are the people that are lecturing us on democracy. I can hardly stand it.
So you brought up a lot there. I heard you paraphrase and then elaborate a lot on a quote that was said by both FDR and Joseph Stalin about democracy not being real unless it actually, meets the needs of people. I thought that was a quite interesting thing that you said there. And I'm reminded, by the way, connecting it to Ukraine, President Lula da Silva of Brazil was recently asked by a journalist. They said, aren't you going to, now that you're president, aren't you going to start sending weapons to Ukraine? Aren't you going to defend democracy in Ukraine? And he said something like, we're not at war with Russia. We're at war with poverty. It's like, this is how people in the global South actually see things. This is why you're seeing so much democratic gains in the global South. It's because they're concerned about development. And that's why there was just, along with the China-Russia summit that happened just a week ago, we saw as well 40 African nations send delegates to Moscow to have a conference on China, Africa, and the multipolar world. And we're seeing countries just disregard this I want to say pedantry or something, just absolute delusion that there's some, like casting a vote every 4 years that most people don't even do, by the way. They said that we had record turnout in the 2022 midterm election. It was like 45%, and then they're bashing, for example, Cuba's elections that happened in 2018. They said, oh, these we're seeing like record low turnout. It was like 75%. Cuba had and their election, and they're in that, the United States has record high turnout at 45%, meaning most people don't vote. There's a lot to dissect there, of course, but we were actually going to have another guest on here as well, and he couldn't make it because his internet connection was bad. He's in Syria. His name is Steven Sahuine, wonderful journalist, and I wanted to have him talk about this. And now you raised this with the issue of Mexico, of designating the cartels as a terrorist organization is basically the pretext to launch a full-scale forever war in Mexico. And we've seen this, by the way, in Syria. There is a U.S. occupation right now that is against the UN Charter, fundamentally in Syria. They're stealing Syria's oil, stealing their resources that the country needs to survive while sanctioning them. And they're using a U.S. military authorization that went back from the Bush administration that was meant for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Now, the strategic reason why these U.S. troops are in Syria, they say, is to create some, to block some kind of Iranian land bridge between Hezbollah and Lebanon, between Syria and to Iran. Well, that first of all, that land bridge already exists. It just makes it a little bit harder for the truck drivers to get there, So that's actually strategically, it doesn't even make sense, that argument. But there is nothing in this authorization that says anything about Iranian-backed militants. Nothing at all. So what you said there is quite an interesting point here, and you see that the United States, has these pretexts, kind of bastardize them, continues the forever wars, and now this idea of a forever war in North America, in Mexico, would be. I mean, I think people don't understand this, but Lindsey Graham is an absolute psychopath for even talking about this, for wanting to invade our neighbor, Mexico. I mean, I say our, I'm in Czech Republic, but I'm a U.S. citizen, and to invade Mexico. What an absolutely phantasmic, just ridiculous idea this man has. Can you speak a little bit about, the U.S. and its anti-democratic policies with regards to the UN Charter, the basic fundamentals of international law?
Absolutely. It's as you said, it's an absurd proposal, but unfortunately, it has credibility in certain circles in the United States. Just yesterday, Rolling Stone published an article that Trump has asked his advisors to draw up plans. Should he become the president, he is very seriously considering actually following through on this. We saw editorials from Mike Pompeo. We saw, op-eds from Bill Barr. And it's interesting that in particular, he talks about not committing to nation building. All we have to do is get in and
before you
strike.
get into this,
And
I want to say something that is just incredible to me about the U.S. media and how censorial and dictatorial this is. So, my local newspaper, every now and then I get this funny idea that I'm going to somehow publish, an op-ed in my local newspaper, and sometimes it gets through. Every once in a while I'll get something in the U.S. media. My columns are actually mostly in Chinese media these days. I'm writing at Global Times, CGTN, blah blah blah. Whatever, China Daily, these kinds of things. I don't get into the U.S. media because my ideas, I'm on actually, I don't know if you know this, I'm on the Ukraine blacklist of people who speak in consonant with Russian propaganda. So this is me. This is my reality, whatever. I'm some kind of Russian propagandist, even though I've said in Russian media that I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is against international law. Now, the context of that is that the U.S. has already trampled on international law. So international law means nothing. So, I mean, whatever. So just just throwing it out there. Now, I put a pitch to my local newspaper in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I'm from, and there's this notion going around that China might sell weapons to Russia. Now, this would be an absolute travesty, apparently. How much the U.S. is sending to Ukraine is fine, but if China would send weapons to Russia, absolute travesty. Now, first of all, what I wanted to write about is not to say, yeah, this is great, China should send weapons to Russia. I wanted to talk about why this is ridiculous, because China has tens of billions of dollars worth of tangible assets in Ukraine. It owns hundreds of thousands of hectares of Ukrainian land. It built ports in Ukraine, Yuzhny port, the Mikhailovka port, the Yuzhny port in Odessa, the largest international port in Odessa, and Mikhailov this city, they built a port there. They built another metro line in Kiev. They own it. Well, they have minority stakes, let's say, and assets all over Ukraine. The idea that China would send weapons to Ukraine to destroy assets that its own companies built is absolutely insane. And I wanted to write about this. And yet, like you said, people like Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, these psychos could get put in print every day, like it's no big deal, talking about bombing countries, going to war with everybody. I even saw, what's his name? Senator from some southern state, Tom Cotton, I think. Tom Cotton, am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Tom Cotton. Yeah, Tom Cotton, this guy. Senator Cotton from somewhere in the South, I don't know, talking about shooting protesters during Black Lives Matter. Gets put in a print like it's nothing. Me, little old me, trying to talk about why the idea that China would ever send weapons to Russia is just absolutely impossible, yet it's still being discussed in diplomatic circles. It's ridiculous. It blows my mind what you've just told me. I mean, I actually, by the way, I didn't read this column, but that's ridiculous. Anyways, go ahead with that. I just wanted to.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you expect too. it's violent language, it's allusions to crime, it rubs, it flaunts international law. One of these op-eds ended up making the argument that, well, under international law, if a state is not doing what it's supposed to do to protect the neighboring population, then they can act unilaterally. What that's actually making reference to is states that are harboring paramilitary groups that make encroachments on the border. Of course, that wouldn't be abide by international law. This idea that somehow the cartels are an extension of the Mexican state, or that the Mexican state is actually providing cover for these organizations, is absurd. It's a total distortion. It's a manipulation. And why? To feed the forever war machine inside of the United States. And that's why the point that I was going to make, which is just basically, they talk about, oh, we're just going to make some targeted drone strike. First of all, we know the history of those drone strikes. Somehow they end up always striking civilian populations.
It's like 70%,
and they
right?
make innocent mistakes.
70-some% is that it's killing civilians.
Absolutely, right? Like, this is not this kind of precise strikes that they're trying to sell the public. No. And of course, what would happen if this actually did go down this way? Of course, there would be creep. It would become a huge conundrum for the U.S. Armed Forces. It wouldn't be long before they'd start talking about boots on the ground, an actual military invasion, which is really dangerous, right? We share a very long border. That would become a very serious security situation. But that also speaks to why you see certain states like Venezuela, for example, that is changing its military doctrine, that it's actually adopting an anti-imperialist military doctrine that says, you know what, the biggest threat to our national sovereignty is actually a potential invasion or the interference of imperialist powers like the United States and its allies. And we should stress that it's not just the US, but it's also, it's also the foreign policy establishment in Brussels. It's also Ottawa. It's also the Asia Pacific, led by Australia and Japan, that are seeking to divide the world and promote their hegemony over that of a multipolar world, which we discussed previously. And it would be incredibly dangerous and harmful and also counterproductive. So, but as you said, it's worrisome that this kind of posturing, these kinds of very dangerous positions, those are allowed to be printed and freely circulate without actually a serious discussion about the implications of what it would mean. Do you think the US population really wants to engage in another land war with a neighboring country that's supposed to be your ally? I'd struggle to think that people would actually be behind that. So they try to sell you this idea that it would only be, these precise strikes, and what are they using to justify this? Well, they always kind of need this dangerous other, right? Sometimes it's the terrorists, and sometimes it's the communists, and then it's the drug traffickers. Well, in this case, now they're really trying to hype up the danger presented by fentanyl. Fentanyl is a real crisis in the United States. We shouldn't minimize that. And the problem is that it's being treated as this criminalized issue as opposed to a public health issue, right? And so they're now using this crisis to say, to help amp up their militaristic rhetoric and thinking, to say that because these cartels are bringing in all this fentanyl, then we have to act against them. And there's actually a poll, and this is by the Cato Institute. So the Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank. It's not any friend of the left, that said that over 60% of Republican supporters now believe that most fentanyl comes into the United States as a result of smuggling by irregular migration. The truth is, the overwhelming majority of fentanyl and its precursors are brought in by people from the who are U.S. citizens. And who are they brought in for? To be consumed by U.S. citizens. And that's actually, and yet they want to pin the blame on us in order to justify their military expenditures, the budget of the Pentagon, and all of these kind of adventures that they go on that can only bring more suffering. Imagine if all of that could actually be invested in the needs of the civilian population in the United States, right? We started this program talking about the Summit for Democracy. Well, the truly democratic act would be to actually meet the demands of the population, to address the crisis of racism and police killings, to invest in communities, to talk about housing. We have this explosion of people living on the streets. All of that could actually be better spent and actually meet the economic, social, and cultural rights of the population. They also deserve to have these protections instead of having their leadership talking about yet another war.
No, that's absolutely right. And I got to say, I grew up, like I said, I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. I grew up in Northern Kentucky. That is like the epicenter of the heroin slash fentanyl crisis. And I've had at least over a dozen of my friends from high school die from this. In fact, I just had a friend of mine die last month, actually, from fentanyl. It's an issue that hits home for me a lot. And I understand, exactly what you're saying is that this has nothing to do with Mexico. This has nothing to do with the Mexican state. It doesn't have to do with undocumented immigrants. Nobody's illegal. Undocumented immigrants, It doesn't have to do with anything, but I think, first of all, big pharma, of course, getting people hooked on these drugs. I know a lot of people who were hooked on Oxycontin when Purdue Pharma was selling a lot of these drugs in Kentucky. And then when the federal government went in and stopped a lot of these prescriptions from being handled, people turned to heroin, and then that turned into fentanyl and blah blah blah. The whole thing. This is a public health crisis. It's not a criminal issue, and it should be treated like one, like you said. And then you also mentioned the gun issue. I mean, my girlfriend is sitting on the couch right here. Hello. We were in Cincinnati in July of last year. We were 30 minutes away from being in the middle of a mass shooting at a pizza parlor that we were at in over the Rhine, Ohio, or in Cincinnati. It's a neighborhood in Cincinnati. We're right on Main Street, right on freaking Main Street in Cincinnati. Almost got shot up. It was right across from our Airbnb. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. And there were 7 other shootings that same night in our neighborhood. That is now, by the way, I don't know if you know this or not, but gun deaths are the leading cause of death for Americans that are aged 1 through 19. Kids and young adults, the leading cause of death, accounting for 20%, over 20% of these deaths. There is not a single country that is a comparable level of development in the United States that is anywhere near this amount, and we're just letting it happen. The gun lobbies are just getting in there, and they can, the corporations, gun lobby, big pharma, all these things. I watch American football here, by the way, here in Prague, and we when I watch with my girlfriend, we're always very interested to see the commercials that Americans are consuming, and we see a lot of drug commercials, and we see a lot of military ads and things like this. So we really know who owns the media. We really know who owns the government. We really understand what's going on. Just kind of this pedestrian viewing of American culture, American high culture, this very violent game, that exploits brown and black bodies, of course. I want to turn gears here. I want to talk about the fact that 2 important NATO allies in the United States, Hungary and Turkey, did not get invited to this latest Summit for Democracy. What do you make of that? The fact that 2 of America's allies, military allies that are in the NATO alliance, did not get the invite.
Yeah, it's odd. By the way, I'm also an American football fan. My team's the Jets, and same
Jets,
thing.
I'm a
I've
Bengals
watched
fan, man.
the streams.
We're actually doing
What's that?
good. I'm a Bengals fan. We're actually doing pretty good now these days.
Oh yeah, yeah. You got a great QB,
But you're about to get Aaron
and so
Rodgers.
for the same reason, I'm always shocked at kind of what is the kind of the propaganda that U.S. People are being exposed to in a lot of this programming. It's actually very useful in that sense, and I always get the same feeling that
It's
there
pretty
is
ridiculous,
very much
isn't
a
it?
transmission, a reproduction of ideology going on.
Yeah.
But in terms of your question, leaving out certain partners, I think speaks to just to the absurdity of this whole exercise. It's not exactly even clear to me what they're trying to accomplish, other than trying to divide the world, right? If this idea that even their close allies, NATO partners, are not invited, but other countries with dubious diplomatic records are, well, it's just, again, it's this effort to try to keep your friends close, right? To say that you're part of the good guys, and I actually think that a lot of it doesn't have a lot of credibility amongst the U.S. population. Like, before the program started today, I started looking, what was the coverage been? What are people saying? And honestly, most of the mainstream coverage has been pretty poor. It hasn't really been leading the newscasts, right? It's like this virtual summit. It's happening over Zoom, right? Like, it doesn't even seem like it's a very serious thing, right? I think it's an exercise in trying to send a certain message, but even that message gets muddled. But and that also speaks to kind of like how poorly managed the foreign policy of the Biden administration has been, you know, I write for Venezuela Analysis, and so I'm forced to pay attention to a lot of what the spokespeople or the key advisors have to say about Venezuela inside the United States. And I brought this up in other interviews, but there was a really useful, enlightening interview that Juan Gonzalez, which is the national security advisor for the Western Hemisphere, so basically the White House's Latin America point person, he was talking about how, oh, we walked away from the previous Trump policy of backing Juan Guaido, of supporting regime change in Venezuela by any means necessary, et cetera, et cetera. Saying that they marked a shift, that they would think things were different now. It's not true at all. Most of Trump's policies towards Venezuela are still in place. They still refuse to recognize the democratically elected government. They have back channel communications. They have face-to-face high-level meetings, but they refuse to take that step. They refuse to lift the criminal illegal sanctions on the Venezuelan population, right? They talk about how these are meant to punish just the regime, but no. I mean, study after study, report after report confirms that this has an impact on the Venezuelan population. They're starving the country of resources. This is all part of the same strategy. If Juan Gonzalez didn't like the Trump strategy, it's not because he somehow was opposed to it. He just didn't find that it was effective, right? That was the actual issue. And so, now they try to convince the world that they're different, that they respect democratic. He literally said at one point in that interview that, our policy is that as long as you're democratically elected, we'll work with you. But we talked about Mexico before. There is no dispute whatsoever that this is a democratically elected government, and you have the Secretary of State breathing life into this notion that there should be military strikes in the country, that we should designate the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. You continue to have sanctions against the Venezuelan population. You continue to support this violent, undemocratic opposition that exists in Venezuela. So, the fact that their key partners aren't being invited just speaks to just how poorly the State Department is actually running things, and why there is increasing resistance to a world that is led by the United States. That actually people welcome this notion that there could be a multipolar world. I think we're on the precipice. It's hard to say exactly we're going to make that leap to say we definitively live in a multipolar world, but I think most people in the global South welcome it. I have some friends. I grew up in the U.S. and Canada as well. That's why I'm a football fan. And they talk about U.S. hegemony has done this and that or whatever, right? Like, not for us, right? Especially Latin America. What has U.S. hegemony meant? Regime change, sanctions, coup plots, right? In 2019, the U.S. backed the undemocratic ouster of Evo Morales, right? Like, it wasn't that long ago. We could go back over and over again.
And that, by the way, I said on election night in the United States that whole situation with Evo Morales was absolutely indicative of what Trump was about to do, which he ended up doing, or attempting to do at least, which now we see Bolsonaro in Brazil doing. So it's a kind of this cascading effect where what was outside is now coming in, is now blowing back, and we're seeing. I read. Sorry, I don't know why I just said there. I read Thomas Friedman's column where he talked about his lunch with Joe Biden, and he's like, "Yeah, I had lunch with Joe Biden. I can't tell you what he said; it was off the record, but it was a really nice lunch. But I got to tell you one thing." Democracy in America is failing because Trump is denying the elections. And I was like, you guys just support the OAS and what they did with Bolivia? I mean, geez. I mean, come on. Okay, so I think this is a good place to leave it there. Another thing, I want to say what you're talking about. I wish the U.S., I check out the budget the U.S. has every year, and it's like the money they put towards diplomacy is at least 10, 15 times less than what they put towards the military. And I think this is any enterprising investigative journalist who's watching this show needs to do a story about this, about the fact that there are so many people who end up in this U.S. government subsidized foreign language programs, rare foreign language like Arabic, Russian, blah, 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 that, you go there, you learn the language, and then you join the State Department or the CIA, whatever. But so many of these people end up freaking radicalized, becoming communists or whatever, that apparently the U.S. doesn't actually have any language experts. And I can tell you right now, for example, that the ambassador here in the Czech Republic does not speak Czech. I absolutely guarantee you that. And I would be surprised if any U.S. diplomat in many other countries around the world actually speaks the native language. That's why they have so many actual local employees managing the day-to-day operations, because they just cannot actually do it. And that's, to me, that's like the basic level of respect of a country that you're in. Is you learn the language, you get attuned to the culture, you kind of, get attuned to everything, and you immerse yourself. But these U.S. diplomats can't do that. They can't understand the world. And that's why it seems they're out of touch with this Summit for Democracy, right? So, good luck
I
with.
cringe every time Brian Nichols uploads a video in Spanish. It's awful. It's like you are
Oh
responsible for
yeah,
the
that
Western
guy.
Hemisphere. Get a coach, right? Like you
Get a
said,
coach.
it's not just me being petty. It's an issue of respect for the place where you're working, right? Like you don't see us communicating in this broken English when we have to address them in these forums, right? There's just and it speaks to just the contempt that I think a lot of them have, right? They don't bother having to learn the language well, because ultimately they feel like they don't have to. But the world is changing. There are more of us. The periphery continues to grow in influence. And like I said, I think it's good that we have some options on the table in terms of what kind of development we want to pursue. We have a different example in China. Maybe that makes more sense, because if ultimately it's about increasing the happiness and the dignity of our populations, and if what works is a different model, or we take inspiration from a different model, I can't hardly see why that would be a problem. But I see why it's a problem for them, because it undermines their hegemony, it undermines their representative model, which is clearly in crisis, which is also clearly in decline.
Hey everybody, if you like this content, please smash that like button. Consider giving it a share. Please subscribe. It's just one button to press. And also, if you feel so inclined, please subscribe to our Patreon to support the page. Anything is appreciated. And we thank you so much for viewing this. And we'll get back to you next week. Thanks a lot.